All right, time now is 7 o'clock. I think it's time to get this party going. So Chief, once again, welcome. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate everyone joining us today. Um, so welcome to our second of our monthly Zoominar seminar, hosted by the Good Cause Foundation, a Davis County community collaboration promoting racial unity and social awareness. My name is Chike Obuehi. Thank you all for joining us this evening once again. For what we hope will be an educational, empowering, and unifying experience, continuing this vital conversation, seeking increased understanding and inclusion for all. This month's Zoominar is titled Together We Rise for Unity with Law Enforcement. And we are so pleased to introduce our very own Kaysville Police Chief, Sol Oberg.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome, Chief. So Chief Oberg has been a police officer for 25 years, with the past 8 years as the Kaysville, Utah Chief of Police. He began his career with the Bountiful Police Department and worked there for 17 years in various assignments, including SWAT, narcotics task force operation, investigations, and patrol before becoming chief. He earned his bachelor's degree in criminal justice administration and his master's degree from the University of Utah in public administration. He is a graduate of Northwestern University's police staff and command course and the Police Executive Research Forum's Senior Management Institute for Police. He is the president of the Utah Law Enforcement Memorial and the vice chair of the Safe Harbor Crisis Center Domestic Violence Shelter. He is a founding board member for the Coalition for Abused Protection of the Elderly and represents the Utah Police Chiefs Association on the Utah Statewide Mutual Aid Committee. He is a recent recipient of the Public Safety Executive Leadership Award from Northwestern University's Center for Public Safety and the first Responder Appreciation Award from the Salt Lake chapter of the NAACP. Thank you for joining us, Chief Oberg.
Thank you, Chike.
Perfect. So in our effort to create bridges and increase understanding, we are facilitating this conversation. And along those lines, any questions that may arise from the audience during our Zoominar, please submit them in the chat and we will address them at the end. So to get started, Chief, I guess as you're already tracking, we have these questions, and we want you to feel free to just respond as much as you can, to the best of your capability. So to start off, can you give us a little background about what it takes to qualify to be a Kaysville City Police officer? And I know that police officers go through training to prepare for their responsibility, but I know very little about the specifics of this process. So can you help educate us on this police training? For example, how long does it take and what subjects are offered during the training?
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing I tell young people when they come to me and they express a desire to go into law enforcement, or somebody that talks about wanting to do that, is I tell them, you've got to be honest in everything you do. That's the number one thing we can't overcome. Issues of dishonesty are a disqualifier, and we don't expect anyone to be perfect because none of us are. But if you're dishonest or involved in activities that involve dishonesty or a lack of integrity, it will disqualify you. So if we can get past that and we get a good, honest candidate, and we start looking at other things that just employers typically look at. Do they have a history of being responsible and have integrity? We try to weed out certain characteristics that we can't have, like do they have a history or a propensity for violence or anger issues? We can't have that. Instances of sexual misconduct in their past. Those are things that are hard to overlook. A lot of drug use is hard to overlook. Some of these things that just reflect on their judgment. because really that's who we are hiring is I can train anybody to do police work, but I can't train them to have good judgment. Either you have it or you don't. Either you have integrity or you don't. So those kinds of things that we can't train are the things that we're looking for. And once we identify a candidate that has those things that we're looking for, these days we're sending them to the police academy because so many people haven't gone. But back when I got hired, there were hundreds of people. We put ourselves through the police academy because we wanted to get hired. But these days we really just don't have people that want to get into this business. And so oftentimes we are sending them to the police academy. We're hiring them first and then sponsoring them through the academy. There's a couple different kinds of academy sessions they can go through. There's one at Post in Salt Lake, the Police Officer Standards and Training. That's a full-time police academy. It's, I believe, 15 weeks long, where they learn everything, give them the foundation for police work. Or they can go to a satellite academy, which is an academy that is run out of a college or university. And we have a bunch of those in our colleges and universities in Utah. And some of those are longer because some of them are part-time or they work off a university schedule. So those tend to be a little bit longer, but the number of hours they put into it is still about 15 weeks full-time. Once we get them back from the police academy, we then have to spend more time training them on the things they didn't learn at the police academy. And typically that's about 12 to 15 weeks that they will ride with an officer, and an officer will take what they learned in the police academy and help them apply it to the job and kind of build on that foundation that they learned. So it's really, all in all, you're probably looking at 8 months of training before they're really out on their own, which is significantly improved from, like, in the 1970s. They would just give somebody the keys to a car and a gun and a uniform, say, okay, go police. And then they had like up to 3 months before they even actually had to send them to the police academy. Things have changed a lot. In the police academy, I just printed off today what one of my cadets in the academy is learning this month. And it's things like report writing, child abuse and neglect, defensive tactics, traffic law, patrol concepts, pedestrian and vehicle stops and approach, recognition and handling of drugs and narcotics, handgun handling and safe operations, domestic violence and cohabitant abuse, sex crimes investigation, procedural justice and police, which is, I think, something that's pertinent to what we're going to be talking about tonight. Intoxilizer, civil disputes, barricaded gunmen, active shooter scenarios. That's kind of what they would learn in maybe, say, 4 weeks time.
Okay, Chief, I think it's interesting that you mentioned honesty, integrity, and good judgment. These are some of those things we don't see on resumes, but are still pertinent in the hiring process. So on that note, are there any specific training in place to ensure that officers engage all people in a fair and just manner? And I think you touched on procedural justice while you're reading off those courses. Can you just buttress on that a little bit?
Yeah, I don't think that there's any training in place that's going to ensure that they treat people with fairness and equity. But we do certainly train them on that. And, it varies from department to department on what type of training and who provides the training and how often it's trained. But like I mentioned, when I was a brand new officer and going through the police academy in 1994, it was one of the very first classes that we took was cultural diversity. It was what it was called then. And now I think it's probably better, procedural justice and police. I think it incorporates more of what, procedural justice is, fairness is, and equity and equality and some of those concepts that we're talking about today. But just Tuesday we had a training. My department had a training on diversity and inclusion and equity. Not any one training is the solution for all of it. Some trainings are, you're going to pick up certain things and someone else might not pick that up. And so I think the key is to make it a continuing effort and a continuing training. And you may reach somebody with one training that won't resonate with somebody else. And so you keep trying to find those things that'll key to them. But really, when you talk about ensuring that officers treat everyone with fairness and dignity and respect, that's really bigger than training, and it's bigger than policy. That's actually an organizational culture issue. And if you can train everybody in the world and you can train them all day long every day on this, but if your culture doesn't have, if that's not part of your culture, it's not going to stick. And so I was lucky when I came to Kaysville. There were a lot of things I changed when I came here. But one thing I noticed and I always admired about this department, even when I was brand new, was that these officers treat people very well. They treat them impeccably. And that was one thing I never really had to address. That culture was already here. And all I had to do was make sure I didn't screw it up. So that my officers will tell you, all of them will tell you, that's one thing. I will do a lot of give and take, and I'm open-minded about a lot of things, but the way we treat people is I'm diehard about. And we treat people the way we would want another officer to treat a member of our family or our loved ones. And there's no other option with me in this department.
Well, that sounds really good. It's interesting that you kind of touched on my follow-up question, which is, do you think that the Kaysville City Police Department has that organizational culture that you just mentioned? And it's good to hear your intake on that topic. So on that note, though, do you feel that these trainings in these areas that you mentioned and all the cultures that comes with it, do you think they are sufficient, or could it be improved?
I think it can always improve. We've had some trainers come in. I've had some very good training that I've sat in on these topics and thought, oh man, I wish I had this for my whole department right now. And we've had some trainings that we brought in that were great, and I thought did what we needed. And then we've had others that were just insufficient, completely insufficient. But this is such a hot topic these days that all of a sudden everybody is an expert on diversity and equity and inclusion, and everybody has a training course. And it can be challenging to find the right one. We had some of our officers attend one, and they came back and described it as just somebody kind of banging their fist on the table saying, you guys are all racist and you need to treat people better. And, without knowing anything about who was in the audience. And, if you think anything they said got through to them, it just doesn't. So, there's some good and bad training. I've been to some incredible stuff, but yeah, it would be nice if we could find a end all be all fantastic trainer, fantastic training, and really adopt that and apply that. That would be fantastic.
Well, that's good to know. So on that note, in recent times we've seen this nationwide protests regarding law enforcement treatment of people of color, and all the protests that kind of arose from that. So it often feels as if we have to choose sides. It's either on the issue, right? It's either you're in favor of a significant police reform or we support the police. What are your thoughts on this? Do you think there are two sides, or do you think it's more nuanced?
I think that a lot of things in our country right now have gotten very, it's either this or this. You're either Republican, you're Democrat, you're conservative, you're liberal, you're black, you're white, you're good, you're bad. And I just don't think any of these issues are really like that. I think it's made out to be more that way from, I think the media kind of plays into that. I think social media really plays into that. But I don't think it's two sides. I think if you ask any law enforcement officer, do you want police work to be better? Every single one of them would say, yes, let's find a way to make this better. And, when we talk about the word reform, I guess that's kind of a trick question. What does reform mean? Because it means something different to everybody and every legislator and in every state. I think there were about 100 reform bills proposed in Utah this year, and some of them really looked like they were trying to help the police and solve problems and contribute positively to quality of life in our communities. And others made absolutely no sense and seemed punitive and or duplicative, or would require a large fiscal note to be able to implement. So I think it really depends on what we're talking about with reform. There's some reform out there that I hear, oh, we're doing this as a reform measure, and I think, I hope everybody's already doing that. And that was the conversation that a lot of us chiefs in Utah had on some of these reform bills is, well, hopefully everybody's already doing that. That doesn't sound like a reform. A lot of these things are already in our policies and our training, and we're doing them. But I think sometimes we get lumped in with what people see or hear is going on in other states. And, I think in Utah, we have a very professional law enforcement as a whole. And that doesn't mean that we don't have room to improve. And that's one of my favorite things about this business is there's always something to work on. And, you're in a people business, and that's the way it is in people business.
Okay. So on that note, in your view, what kind of impact is your division having on your work here in Kaysville?
Like the division that's going on right now with some
right. That is correct.
In Kaysville, we've been pretty fortunate in that I think we as a department have done some things to try to build these bridges over the years. And so I think we have a good relationship with our community, and we have a community that hasn't necessarily always been supportive of the department, but I think they are very supportive. I think they see what we're doing, and they buy into what we're doing. And we don't see a lot of divisiveness in our city, in our department. And there's always, some small things here and there. But for the most part, we really haven't seen a lot of divisiveness here.
So it seems that much of police forces interaction with the people they protect is based on faith in the system. With that in mind, how important is public trust in policing? And as a police force, how do you try to increase that public trust?
This comes back to police legitimacy. So the state gives us police powers, and our government, gives us the ability to do these things. But we're really not a legitimate power or legitimate force unless the public recognizes our legitimacy. And that's where the trust comes in. So if our public doesn't trust us and trust our policies, our procedures, our officers, then they're not going to be compliant with anything. They're not going to be compliant with laws, with us. And I think that's some of what we're seeing in other parts of the country, particularly where I think, there's been a mistrust for many, many years or even generations in some parts of the country. And so some of the things we try to do is we try to involve ourselves with the public. We try to engage with the public and members of our community outside of our normal duties, because by the time we get called to your house, for instance, it's too late. It's not a good opportunity to engage with you. Those engagements need to occur outside of our routine duties. So speaking with kids at schools, we have a very strong school resource officer program and DARE program. And it lets us kind of build a relationship with people that we normally wouldn't have an opportunity to do that with. We go to a lot of special events and try to host some seminars and things like that here when it's not, when we're not stopped by COVID. Um, to just try to address some of the issues we're having in the community and try to extend our hand and be a partner with the community. And really that's been one of the hardest things to do. When I got here, I felt like there was a certain amount of apathy towards the police, and trying to break down that apathy with our community has been a big challenge for me.
Well, it's interesting hearing about the apathy you mentioned and all of that. Um, on that note, some people would say things like racism doesn't exist in Kaysville. We love everyone here. How would you respond to that?
I guess my gut would be to say, we'll talk to one of my Black officers who was called a racial slur in his first couple months, and then tell me that racism doesn't exist. And that's just me going off emotions because it pisses me off. But we have had a couple hate crimes here over the last couple of years. We had a young man's car graffitied with the racial slur. We're not positive it happened in Kaysville, but when he was visiting a friend's house and found it on his car in Kaysville, so we can't say it didn't happen here. And I guess the non-emotional side of me and try to engage somebody intellectually about this would say, well, none of us really know our neighbors. None of us really truly know what's in the heart and minds of our neighbors. So we might think we do. But an example would be every single person that I've ever known to have committed suicide, they were the last person I ever would have thought would have done that. And I was shocked and thought I knew them better than this. And I don't think we ever really truly know people. But I would also say we all have our own individual biases. Every single one of us has our biases, and those biases even change. So as they're based off of our personal experiences. Now, whether that starts out how you were raised and then turns into a broader range of experiences, but as we grow and mature through our life, our experiences change and our biases even change. And so even if you think you know somebody now, maybe you don't in a year, maybe something's happened. And I guess that's what I would say.
Well, I think that was a good response. So to the next question, it seems that so much of police work, especially in Kaysville, and I'm sure all around the country, is unnoticed and unappreciated. Can you think of any specific examples of incidents, traffic stops, response to 911 call, etc., where you are especially proud of how your team within the Kaysville Police Department responded?
Yeah, I'm proud of our department and our officers because I think they do their best work with our disadvantaged populations. So our most at-risk populations, whether it's our youth, our elderly, our people in a mental or emotional crisis, even some of our economically disadvantaged people, some of our people that are in the domestic violence shelter, or victims of sex abuse and sex assault. I think our people do their best work with that. I was putting together our awards program this week, in fact, and so I've had an opportunity to look back on a couple of those things that have happened recently. And recently we had a young man, it was called in as a juvenile problem. And what we had was a young man who was trying to kill himself by jumping off of an overpass. And the officers had to physically engage with him and fight with him to try to restrain him from jumping off the overpass. And we had another incident with a juvenile who had cut their wrists and we were trying to locate them, and my school resource officers knew enough about kids that they were able to track this person down, and they were dying, essentially bleeding to death in a parking lot, and they were able to save them. One example I like to throw out is a couple of years ago, we had a person at a gas station who was going to kill himself by pouring gasoline all over himself. And our officers responded, and they cleared people out of the convenience store and the restaurant that was attached to it, and engaged with him, and tried to save him, tried to knock the lighter out of his hand, but ultimately he was able to ignite himself and lit himself and them on fire. And some of my, they put their lives at risk to intervene and try to save this person. And they just do tremendous work. They have big hearts. One of my officers just the other day was driving to a call and saw somebody sitting on the curb at a bus stop, and then drove back to get some lunch and saw the guy still there, and he started wondering. So he picked up his lunch and went back and went and engaged this person, and found that he was a homeless person, didn't have money for the bus stop, and he gave him his lunch. And just that big heart that these men and women have, it just is very inspirational and really unbelievable. We have unbelievable people policing our streets in Kaysville, and I'm grateful to work with them.
Well, on that note, I would like to show my appreciation and say thank you to you and your team for what you do for our community. We really do appreciate you all.
Thank you.
So, so from your perspective as the Kaysville City Police Chief, what is something each of us could do today, tomorrow, on a daily basis to help increase racial unity, social awareness in our community?
I'm going to say that it seems like I think that it's very easy, it's comfortable, and it's easy for us to categorize people and look at things in terms of black and white, no pun intended. But it's easy to put things in categories and live in that black and white. But really, our whole world is living in the gray, working in the gray. Nothing is as simple as it seems, and everybody is got their own challenges. And I tell my people, if you haven't been hit with some really tough adversity, hold on, because it's coming your way. It's coming everybody's way, whether it's a health issue or mental illness or some kind of financial trouble. And I think it's really easy just to categorize somebody. If somebody's poor, how do we look at them? Do we assume, oh, they're lazy, they're uneducated, they're dumb? I mean, there's so many little stereotypes that we apply to different people in every part of our day. And that goes back to kind of the biases I was talking about based off our own experiences. And I would tell people to challenge your biases, figure out what they are. And it's hard work, but that is the only way you're actually going to be able to be more socially aware, is if you challenge your own biases. And I'll share one of my own biases that I've come across since I've been a police chief. When we were hiring these new officers, we would have, seemed like a couple of years, we would have a lot of young men come to us, and I'd say, okay, tell me about your employment history, stuff like that. And for a while, I was getting a lot of these young men would say, well, I got married, we had a kid, and we decided my wife would, we would work on her career, so I would stay home with the kids. And I struggled with that. I thought, that is too big of a leap to go from no life experience, and now all of a sudden I'm going to give him a gun and a badge, and he's going to be, making decisions, these big level decisions. But then at the same time, I found myself when a young gal would come in and say, I've been staying home with the kids or whatever, and now I want to start a career. I was all for it. And I'm, oh yeah, let's do this. And at some point it hit me, what's the difference? there is no difference. It's my own bias, my own experiences, my own beliefs are telling me that I should hire this young gal over this young man. And really what that is a gender bias that I had. And it's something I find myself still having to work on. It's not the gender bias you would think, where I have a bias against the opposite sex, but I had a bias against my own gender on some of these people and their decisions because it probably didn't align with what I had decided to do as a young man. But it doesn't mean it's wrong, and I had to catch myself on that. But that's just one example. I think we all have those biases built in, and if we want to be more socially aware, we need to have some self-awareness first.
Well, thank you very much, Chief, for sharing that. And I'm sure if we all search deep inside, we all can dig up one or two biases. And your challenge to our community is to challenge our own biases, and I appreciate that. And I think I will personally be doing that myself. So we have a couple of questions come in, and and I'll just take them as they come in. And the first one says, in your work in the schools, do you address issues related to diversity and social awareness?
Do our officers?
Yes. So do you, in your work within the schools, do you address any issues, based on diversity and social awareness?
Our officers don't teach a lot of that stuff. And when they become part of when they're needed, then yeah, they do address that stuff where they can. But they're really not there to teach, and we're really cautious about intervening in a criminal way, because there's a lot of concern about kind of that school to prison pipeline that I think is more of a concern in some other parts of the country. But trying to apply criminal or police resolutions to things that are happening in our schools, we're really cautious about that, and try to stay away from that. And we're more there to try to help make that place secure and prevent crimes that are occurring in the schools. I don't know if that answers the question, but.
And I think you're totally on point. And what I hear you say is, hey, we're trying to tread this fine line of focusing on what we are in the schools to do, as opposed to entangling ourselves in all of this additional stuff that can be a distraction every once in a while. Does that sound right?
Yeah, and not necessarily our role.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you for that response. So on that note, and another question just came in that says, is there any specific bias training for your department? And I am thinking of these questions in terms of you saying, hey, you had to catch yourself, in your own personal bias. For those who for one reason or the other are not able, or not necessarily have not taken the time to review their own biases and be personally aware of them. Is there any specific training that you and your team kind of designed for yourselves to remind you guys of these issues?
Yeah, in fact, we're doing a training for some of our department in mid-March, where we a couple times a year we take a group of officers, and that's one of the topics that we go over. We go over a lot of different topics, but that is one of the topics I talk about some of the pillars in the 21st Century Policing report that came out under President Obama's time. I actually went back to DC and had the opportunity to take advantage of some of that training that some of the police chiefs got at the White House. And we try to bring that back and try to apply it here to our line officers. And we try to prime them for this kind of stuff. So that actually is a question I ask commonly in the interview process. is tell me about one of your biases. And it always throws people off. But what I hope it does is prepare them, kind of prime them, like, ooh, I need to be thinking about this. And we ask it in promotional exams, and actually a lot of the psychological exam that we do in the hiring process is based off of that also. So they get a primer even actually before we hire them. And often what we see in these candidates in there before we've actually hired them is just kind of a lack of self-awareness about their biases, which is to be expected. If I think, me at age 23, when I was first coming into police work, I wasn't nearly as evolved, and I don't think I had any clue what my biases were then. But the psychological profile starts to prime them for that, and then we continue that with some of our trainings that we do throughout their career.
Well, thank you, Chief. I appreciate that response. And the next question says, we hear phrases like blue walls and qualified immunity, and as an ordinary citizen, I wonder, what do you feel like is happening in Utah to hold police accountable?
I think that there's a little bit of a misnomer or misunderstanding, because I get the same thing thrown at me. In fact, I was doing a press release with a member of the media last week, and she asked, one of the questions she asked was, Chief, it had to have been really hard for you to do this investigation on one of your own officers. How did that make you feel? I said, it wasn't hard. We do that all the time. It's a matter of procedure. We constantly do internal investigations, and it's nothing against the officers. It's part of the business. And when we have to constantly make sure our officers are following policy and procedure, number one, and state law. And it's an ongoing part of the complaint process, and transparency and accountability, and the things that are our foundation, really. And I've had plenty of internal affairs investigations done against me, and it can be scary, but frankly, if you don't have anything to hide, there's nothing to worry about. And if you've done something wrong, it's an opportunity to improve. This right here is our policies that these are our department policies that these guys have to abide by. So, every once in a while, yeah, you're going to violate a policy because there's a lot in there. And there's times that I have to look in policy to make sure I'm following it. So we don't expect them to be perfect, but we do try really hard to make sure we're all following policy and procedure, our protocols, and state laws. And at times, officers need to be disciplined for it, and that's nothing personal against the officer. It's part of it's part of just existing, working. So it doesn't mean they're bad officers per se, depending on what they've done, obviously, but it just means that they've done something that they could do better on next time.
Sounds good. Sounds good. So on that note, I think it's interesting you're showing us those 200, 300 pages of policies. I think it will be an interesting read, maybe for me. So on that note, Chief, is our state an anomaly with those procedures you mentioned?
This policy?
Yes, those policies and procedures you're talking about. Hey, we do these internal investigations all the time. Do you think this is peculiar to the Kaysville City Police Department, or do you think it is something most of the police departments out there do?
I think most police departments do it. In fact, a lot of us share a very similar policy. I would bet maybe 30 to 50% of all police departments in the entire country share that same policy right there. Some tweaks are going to be different depending on state laws, because each individual state has its own special laws. But for the most part, basic policies are basic policies. And, and internal affairs investigations have been around since long before I got into this business 25 years ago. I think some departments do a better job of it than others, certainly. And I think in some parts of the country, police unions can be troubling. They can be tough to overcome. I know some chiefs personally in other parts of the country that have wanted officers fired, and somehow through the union collective bargaining, they've had to come back to work, or their discipline's been appealed to some sort of judiciary body that is then sent the officers back. I mean, some of those things are tough to overcome, and they are problematic. In Utah, we're fortunate that we don't have police unions here, at least from my point of view. Maybe the officers would prefer that, but from my point of view, it's nice not to have the police unions. And even though Salt Lake City has what's called a union, they're mostly for collective bargaining for wages and things, and don't have the power that a police union on the East or West Coast would have.
Right. Okay, so one last question for you, Chief. So Kaysville has historically been notoriously not diverse. As the city grows and our community grows more diverse, how would you suggest your police officers will respond to ensure that their own, I think you touched on this bias issue, but I think it's pretty important that people understand how much of a role the bias plays into the policing and that community trust and that interaction between police and citizens. So going back to the question, so how would you suggest your officers respond to ensure that their own individual biases and possible cultural bias within the department are addressed, trained, and held accountable? And I think you touched on the training, the accountability side of things, and all of that. But I think this should be your opportunity to just give, a general overview or general response to all of those bias-related, training-related, and accountability-related issues. If you have any last words.
Well, one thing we haven't really talked about much is some of the systems we have in place here, and I think systems are very important. Audits. In the financial world, you do audits, and like at the state level, the governor's office, they do performance audits, and we audit a lot of what we do. So our officers, supervisors will periodically review their body camera footage to see, check how they responded with people. That's in addition to the reports, or they show up on scene to see how we're dealing with people. And we try to audit our own behavior as much as we can. And our officers are used to that. That's just part of how we do business. They know it's not us mistrusting them or thinking they're doing anything wrong. But occasionally we do find areas that they can improve on. And I think that's my job as a chief, if I truly care about these officers and the public, is that I help them to succeed and do better. The public needs that from me. They need it from me. And we've put in a series of systems like that. We audit our evidence room. It's the same kind of mentality, is to do these audits and make sure that we are performing as we should. And in one example, we did uncover what we thought was a bias. Several years ago, we had an officer who responded to a domestic violence call, and instead of taking the action he should have taken, he counseled the victim to stay with the abuser, and that's not his role. And so it raised the question, well, where did this come from? It's outside of his training, it's outside of the policy. So we started looking at, is there some other influence that maybe caused him to react that way? And ultimately, we decided it was a religious influence. It was very important in his religion. The family unit was very important, and that came out. And it wasn't a malicious thing on his part. He was truly doing what he thought was best in that case. Yeah, it was part of his religious bias that came out, and so we identified that and helped him recognize it and work through that so that it wouldn't happen again with him. And if it does happen again, then we would need to take some different actions. Some of those things I think are important in not only police departments, but really any organization if you want to be successful.
That is correct. Well, thank you very much, Chief. That is all our questions for today. We really do appreciate you, Chief, and for your time and for joining us tonight. I think you've given us lots of nuggets, lots of things to think about as a community. You've been able to answer a lot of the questions that we can that we have. So we are very thankful to you and your department for everything you do for our community. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Okay, so for police departments out there tuning in and joining us and other individuals interested in bias training, we have Dr. Diane McAdams Jones, who offers phenomenal courses through Just Us Socializing. Her company can be contacted through her website, justussocializing.net, as well as through her email, justussocializing@gmail.com. Thank you all very much for joining us. We hope that these conversations continue in your homes, in our schools, in the workplace, creating further connections and understanding as together we all rise. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Thank you. Thank you, Chief.
Thank you.
So good night.